You ever see a dog do something so human it stops you cold? Not a trick, not a command. I mean something real, something that changes everything. This is the story of a German shepherd who didn't just serve the law, he saved the truth. In a courtroom full of doubt, this canine saw what no one else could, and with one impossible act, he proved that loyalty isn't just a word carved into a badge, it's a heartbeat. We talk a lot about heroes in uniforms, but sometimes the quiet ones, the ones with four paws and unspoken instincts, show us what courage really looks like. I've spent years studying stories of police dogs and their handlers, moments where trust outperformed training, where instinct outshined protocol, and every single time, it reminds me how deep the bond between humans and animals truly runs. So if you've ever wondered what love, loyalty, and redemption look like when spoken through a bark instead of words, stay with me. Because by the end of this video, you won't just believe in the power of a dog, you'll understand why they always find the truth when we can't. The morning sky hung heavy over the city courthouse, a dull sheet of gray that swallowed the sun whole. Rain tapped against the wide glass windows in slow, steady rhythms. Not the kind that refreshes, but the kind that sinks into bones, bringing with it a quiet sadness. Inside the courthouse lobby, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and wet coats. Footsteps echoed against the marble floor as people moved briskly, their whispers fading beneath the hum of fluorescent lights. Officer Daniel Holt stood at the end of the long corridor, his shoulders squared, but his face marked with exhaustion. He had seen too much in his years on the force, too many broken homes, too many silent cries. Yet standing beside him now, clutching a small, worn teddy bear to her chest, was a sight that pierced him deeper than any case ever had. Lena, just 7 years old, was a ghost of a child. Her small frame trembled beneath a pale blue coat 2 sizes too big. Her brown hair was tied loosely, strands sticking to her damp cheeks. She didn't speak, didn't even glance at the strangers passing by. Her eyes, hollow, unfocused, seemed to look somewhere far beyond the walls of the courthouse, into a place only she could see. Daniel crouched down so his eyes met hers. "It's okay, kiddo," he said softly, though his voice wavered more than he wanted it to. "You're safe now. You don't have to talk if you don't want to." She didn't respond. The only sound was the faint squeak of her shoes against the polished floor as she shifted her weight. Behind them, Rex, Daniel's loyal German, Shepherd K9. Partner, padded silently, his fur still damp from the rain outside. At 5 years old, Rex was a magnificent creature, tall, broad-chested, with dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through people. He had been by Daniel's side through search operations, hostage rescues, and endless nights of patrols. But today, even the seasoned dog seemed to move more slowly, his instincts sharpened by the fragile aura of the child beside him. Daniel adjusted the strap of his shoulder holster and glanced toward the courtroom doors ahead. "We'll just go in, sit for a bit, and make sure everything's okay," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. But when they reached the doorway, Lena froze. Her small fingers tightened around her teddy bear until the seams strained. Her breathing quickened. The polished wooden doors loomed over her like cliffs. Behind them, the men and women in suits, the questions, the staring eyes. Daniel paused, understanding. He'd seen hardened criminals flinch less at the thought of a trial. This, he realized, was a child about to face her nightmare again. Not through memory, but through words. He crouched beside her once more. "Hey," he whispered, his tone gentle but firm. "You see that badge on my chest? That means I'm right here with you. No one can hurt you again. Not while Rex and I are around. Lena didn't answer, but her lips trembled as if she wanted to. The silence stretched between them, heavy but meaningful. That was when Rex moved forward. The German shepherd lowered his head and pressed his nose softly against the girl's hand. Startled, Lena blinked, once, twice, and then her grip loosened. Rex nudged the teddy bear gently, then rested his paw near her, shoo. His body language calm, patient. It was a small gesture, but something shifted in the air. The girl's breathing slowed. She looked down at the dog's amber eyes, so warm, so steady. And for the first time that morning, a faint smile flickered on her lips. It wasn't much, barely a curve, but to Daniel it was a sunrise breaking through months of storm. "You see?" he murmured. "He knows you're brave." Rex's tail wagged once, slow and rhythmic, as if confirming it. Daniel straightened, watching the two of them for a moment. His throat tightened with emotion he didn't dare show. There were days when his badge felt like armor. Today, it felt like a burden. He turned his gaze toward the courtroom door, his reflection faint in the glass pane beside it. Rain streaks blurred his image, making him look older than his years. He remembered the first time he'd been assigned to a child witness case. The victim back then had been 14, terrified, but talkative. Lena, though, she was different. The trauma wasn't just something she carried. It had built walls around her soul. He glanced down at Rex, the only creature who seemed able to reach her. "You're our bridge today, partner," he thought. "Don't let me fail her." As the bailiff called them forward, Daniel took a deep breath. The hallway light flickered once, then steadied. A fragile symbolism that didn't escape him. He gently placed a hand on Lena's shoulder. "Ready, sweetheart?" She didn't answer in words, only gave a tiny nod. Together, they stepped forward. Daniel first, then Lena, and finally Rex, his gait proud and protective. The trio crossed the threshold of the courtroom, where truth and fear waited side by side. Inside, murmurs ceased as they entered. Reporters, clerks, and officers turned their heads. To them, it was just another case number, another file. But for Daniel, it was a battle between human fragility and faith. Faith that maybe, just maybe, truth could still be heard, even through silence. As they approached the witness stand, Daniel could hear the faint hum of the rain beyond the windows, the world continuing indifferent to the storm within these walls. He took a step back, letting Lena sit with the counselor assigned to her. Rex lay down by the bench, eyes fixed on her every move. The air smelled faintly of varnish and fear. For a brief moment, Daniel allowed himself to remember. He remembered the night Rex had saved a kidnapped child 2 years ago. How the dog had barked frantically at a locked shed no one thought to check. Inside, they'd found the boy, weak but alive. The case had earned Rex a commendation, a shiny medal he never understood but wore proudly. Now, standing in the sterile brightness of the courtroom, Daniel prayed for the same miracle. "Please, God," he thought, "let today end in truth, not trauma. Let this child walk out of here lighter than she came in." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly, a low, distant echo like the growl of fate itself. Inside, the little girl sat motionless, a fragile figure beneath the weight of justice. And beside her, the faithful German shepherd waited, eyes steady, heart ready, sensing what the humans could not. Daniel adjusted his uniform and took one last look at them both. Then, as the judge's gavel struck and the trial began, a single thought crossed his mind. Sometimes, the smallest silence carries the loudest truth. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that presses against the skin and makes breathing feel heavier. The dull hum of the fluorescent lights filled the air, flickering slightly above the polished oak tables. Outside, the rain continued to fall, faintly audible through the thick courthouse windows. But in this room, every sound seemed magnified. The shuffle of paper, the creak of a chair, the nervous cough of an attorney. At the center of it all sat Lena, her small figure almost swallowed by the witness stand. Her teddy bear rested on her lap like a fragile anchor. Her hair had been combed neatly that morning, but a few strands now clung to her cheeks, damp with nervous sweat. Across from her stood the defense attorney, tall, composed, with the kind of confidence that filled the room. His tone was polite, but beneath it lingered something sharp, a subtle pressure meant to corner, to confuse, to control. "So, Lena," he began, voice smooth as glass, "you said you were in your room that evening. Are you sure you didn't just imagine what happened?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Lena blinked, her small fingers tightening around her bear. I saw." Her voice was thin, barely audible. "You saw? Or you thought you saw?" the lawyer interrupted, taking a slow step closer. "It's important to be very clear, Lena. Sometimes our minds play tricks on us, especially when we're frightened. Isn't that right?" Daniel, sitting just behind the prosecutor's table, felt his stomach twist. His fists clenched against his knees. He could almost hear the strain of the girl's shallow breathing from across the room. She looked smaller now, shrinking under the man's calculated words. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, shifted slightly in her chair. Her expression hardened, but she didn't intervene. The law demanded neutrality, even when empathy begged otherwise. Daniel's jaw tensed. Procedure. Always procedure. It was the rule he lived by, until moments like this, when humanity began to crack its edges. The defense lawyer leaned in again, voice still smooth. "You care about telling the truth, don't you, Lena?" The little girl nodded weakly. "Good," he said. "Now, you said your stepfather came into your room that night. But could it be that you had a nightmare? Children have nightmares all the time, don't they?" Lena's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her chest rose and fell quickly, panic building behind her eyes. She looked around the room as if searching for something. Someone. To save her. Daniel's throat tightened. His hands gripped the edge of the bench until his knuckles turned white. Every instinct in him screamed to stand up, to call out, to tell the man to stop. But he couldn't. He was an officer, not a witness. Beside him, Rex lay at his feet, still as stone but alert. The dog's ears twitched, his gaze fixed on the trembling child. Then, as Daniel's frustration began to boil, Rex emitted a soft, almost imperceptible whine, a sound that cut through the courtroom's tension like a thread of warmth. Daniel glanced down. Rex's eyes met his, deep, steady, understanding. The officer exhaled slowly, grounding himself through that silent exchange. Across the room, the prosecutor shifted forward in her chair. "Objection, Your Honor," she said finally, her voice sharp. "The witness is a minor. The question is leading and emotionally coercive." The defense lawyer raised his eyebrows. "I'm simply seeking clarity. If the child is truthful, she has nothing to fear." The judge lifted a hand, silencing them both. "Objection sustained. Counselor, adjust your tone." But the damage had already been done. Lena's shoulders hunched. Her small fingers trembled as she tried to hold the teddy bear still, but the fabric kept slipping. The courtroom lights felt unbearably bright, bleaching her face until she looked almost translucent. Daniel could see the tears forming at the corners of her eyes. He had seen grown men break under interrogation, but nothing compared to watching a child fight to hold herself together. Lena, the prosecutor spoke gently now. Can you tell us what you remember? Just in your own words. The girl swallowed hard. He came in, and I said no, but he... Her voice cracked, splintering mid-sentence. A sob escaped before she could stop it. The room went completely still. Daniel felt his heart split. His hand found Rex's fur, gripping it tightly, as if anchoring himself from leaping forward. Rex's breathing was calm, but his eyes, those deep amber eyes, followed every movement of the child's trembling hands. The defense lawyer looked uneasy now, glancing toward the judge, perhaps realizing he had gone too far. But no one spoke. The silence was sacred, painful, human. Finally, Lena covered her face. I can't, she whispered through tears. The judge's gavel came down softly, a single, merciful sound. We'll take a 15-minute recess. Relief washed through the room like a quiet tide. Reporters whispered, lawyers gathered papers, and the audience began to stir. But Daniel didn't move. He rose slowly and walked to the front, ignoring protocol for the first time. The bailiff hesitated, then stepped aside, recognizing the look in his eyes, the look of a man no longer thinking as an officer, but as a human being. Lena sat frozen, tears streaking her cheeks. When Daniel knelt beside her, she didn't react at first. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a clean handkerchief. Hey, he said softly. You did good in there. You really did. She shook her head weakly. I couldn't talk. That's okay, Daniel replied. You don't have to be brave alone. We'll help you, Rex and me. You're not alone in this, Lena. Her lip quivered. Slowly, she turned her head toward the corner where Rex stood waiting near the bench. The German shepherd tilted his head slightly, as if understanding the moment. Lena reached out a trembling hand. Daniel nodded to Rex. The dog padded forward on silent paws, stopping right beside her. For a moment, no one in the courtroom moved. Then Lena leaned forward and wrapped her arms around Rex's neck, burying her face in his fur. He understands me, she whispered. The words were faint, nearly lost beneath the hum of distant thunder. But Daniel heard them, and something deep within him shifted. It wasn't just comfort that passed between them. It was trust. Hope. The beginning of something that would change everything. He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his voice barely a murmur. Yeah, sweetheart. He does. As the lights dimmed slightly and the courtroom emptied for recess, the image lingered. A little girl clinging to a dog's neck like a lifeline, and an officer watching them both with the quiet knowledge that somehow, against all odds, truth had just found its first fragile breath. The storm outside had passed, but the tension inside the courthouse was heavier than ever. By the time Officer Daniel Holt arrived that morning, the steps leading up to the entrance were already lined with cameras and reporters. Microphones jutted forward like bayonets, flashing lights flickered in the drizzle, and voices shouted questions that cut through the damp air. Officer Holt, any update on the child's condition? Is it true the prosecution has no solid evidence? Do you believe the accused will walk free? Daniel ignored them all. His jaw was tight, his hand resting on Rex's leash as the German shepherd walked calmly by his side. Behind them, an officer escorted Lena and her mother through the side entrance, trying to shield the child from the camera flashes. But even from a distance, Daniel could summit her small shoulders trembling beneath her coat. Inside, the courthouse buzzed like a hive of whispered doubt. The defense had spent the last 24 hours painting the accused, Martin Calloway, a once beloved community volunteer, as a misunderstood man, a mentor, a neighbor, a pillar of kindness. A man who could never do the things the girl claimed he did. Daniel had seen that look before. The carefully rehearsed humility, the sympathetic nods, the faint smirk when no one was watching. It made his blood boil. He stood near the prosecutor's bench, his uniform crisp, but his eyes shadowed with sleepless nights. The prosecutor, Miss Jennings, was flipping through her notes, her face pale and drawn. She leaned toward Daniel and whispered, "If the defense keeps pushing, like this, the jury might lose faith in her. Her story's changing under pressure." Daniel's throat tightened. "She's 7, he said, voice low but firm. "They're twisting her words." Jennings nodded grimly. "I know, but the law doesn't bend for emotion." That line cut deeper than it should have. Daniel had spent his career upholding the law, arresting criminals, testifying with precision, following rules even when they hurt. But today, every rule felt like a chain keeping justice from breathing. As the doors opened and the courtroom filled again, Daniel took his seat at the back, Rex lying silently beside him. The air was stifling, thick with murmurs. Journalists filled the benches, pens poised, waiting to capture either justice or failure. At the front, Martin Calloway sat beside his lawyer, his suit immaculate, his hands folded neatly on the table. When the bailiff announced the start of the session, Martin even smiled faintly, nodding toward the jury as though greeting friends. Daniel could barely stand to look at him. The prosecutor rose to continue questioning, but her voice carried a hint of strain. "Lena," she said gently, "can you tell us again what happened that night?" The child hesitated. Her lips trembled, eyes darting toward the defense lawyer, who was already smirking, waiting to strike. I heard the door," she whispered. "Then he—" "Objection!" the defense lawyer cut in smoothly. "Leading question, and the child's prior statement contradicts this version." The judge sighed, rubbing her temple. "Sustained. Counselor, rephrase." Jennings bit her lip, choosing her words carefully. "Lena, did someone come into your room that night?" The little girl nodded slowly. "Yes." "And who was it?" She hesitated again. "It was—" her voice faltered. "It was him." Her small finger rose shakily toward the man at the table. For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. But the defense lawyer stood immediately, his tone dripping with mock concern. "Miss Lena, you've had a very difficult time lately, haven't you? Lots of questions, lots of people talking to you." She blinked, unsure how to answer. He took a few steps forward, lowering his voice. "Sometimes when grown-ups ask us things again and again, we start to think we saw things that didn't really happen. You understand, don't you?" Her lips quivered. I'm not lying." "Of course not," he said, almost kindly. "But maybe you're confused?" That word, confused, echoed in the air like an accusation. Daniel's fists clenched on his knees. His breathing grew heavy, controlled only by the rhythmic sound of Rex's steady breaths beside him. The dog's ears flicked back, sensing the rising tide of tension in his handler. Then, quietly, Rex growled, a low, warning sound that vibrated from his chest, not loud enough to interrupt the proceedings, but enough that Daniel placed a calming hand on his back, level, moderate. "Easy, boy," he whispered, but inside he felt the same primal urge to stand, to defend, to shout down the cruelty masquerading as logic. The defense pressed on, relentless. "Lena, you told the detective one thing last week, and something different today. Which story is true?" Her small hands gripped the armrest, knuckles white. "They're both true," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "But they can't both be true, can they?" the lawyer said, his tone sharpening. You see, ladies and gentlemen, even the witness isn't sure of what she saw. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Daniel felt something break inside him. He wanted to slam his fist on the table, to remind them that trauma wasn't a straight line, that memory twisted under fear. But he couldn't. The rules forbade him. The badge on his chest demanded restraint. He looked toward Lena. The child's eyes darted wildly, searching for an anchor, for something real. Then, they found Rex. The German shepherd's head tilted slightly. His gaze was calm, unwavering, as if silently telling her, "You're not alone." Lena took a shaky breath, but the damage was done. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks in trembling lines. The jury shifted uncomfortably. Even the judge's expression softened for a brief second. When the defense finally stepped back, the silence was suffocating. The prosecutor sat down slowly, defeated. Daniel's throat ached. A single tear escaped and rolled down his cheek before he could wipe it away. It wasn't just sorrow. It was fury. The helpless kind that burns deep because there's nothing you can do without breaking the system you swore to protect. As the session adjourned for lunch, Daniel stayed seated, staring at the empty witness chair. The sound of footsteps, papers rustling, murmured conversation, all of it blurred into background noise. Rex nudged his leg, resting his head against Daniel's knee. The officer placed a trembling hand on his partner's back and whispered, "We can't let her fall, buddy. Not her." Outside, reporters waited to spin their headlines. Inside, an officer and his dog sat in quiet defiance, the only two souls who still believed the truth would survive the storm. The courthouse hallways were almost empty now, echoing faintly with the fading footsteps of lawyers and officers heading out for a late lunch. The fluorescent lights buzzed above like tired sentinels, casting a sterile glow across the marble floor. The storm outside had quieted into a light drizzle, but inside the air still felt thick, heavy with uncertainty and quiet despair. Officer Daniel Holt stood by the vending machine, hands buried deep in his pockets, staring at nothing. The morning's testimony still replayed in his mind. Lena's trembling voice, the defense's relentless interrogation, the helpless look in her mother's eyes. It was the kind of day that hollowed a man out from the inside. A soft voice broke the silence behind him. "Officer Holt." Daniel turned. Mrs. Alvarez, Lena's mother, stood a few feet away, her hands gripping the strap of her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. Her makeup had faded from crying. Her eyes were red and swollen. She looked like a woman balancing on the edge of collapse. "Mrs. Alvarez," he said gently, taking a step closer. "You should be resting. Lena needs you strong." Her lips trembled. "That's exactly why I came to find you." She glanced around the empty hallway, as if afraid someone might overhear. I think something's missing from the case files." Daniel frowned. "Missing? What do you mean?" She hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. "The hospital. When Lena was treated after that night, they wrote a report. There were photographs, a note from the attending nurse, and a doctor's statement. I saw it. I even signed the release forms. But when I asked the prosecutor this morning, she said those papers were never submitted to evidence." Daniel's pulse quickened. "You're certain?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I wouldn't forget something like that. That report, it proved what he did. It proved everything." Her voice cracked. "Without it, they'll call her a liar." Daniel's jaw tightened. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a small notepad. "When was this?" 2 days after it happened," she said, swallowing hard. County General Hospital. A nurse named Maria Santiago handled the paperwork. Daniel scribbled the details down quickly. You did the right thing coming to me. I'll look into it immediately. She nodded weakly. Please, Officer Holt. I can't lose her again. The court, the questions, the way they look at her, it's killing her. I know, Daniel said softly, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. I'll find out what happened. As she walked away, clutching her purse like a shield, Daniel stood there for a long moment, the sound of the rain filling the void she left behind. Something about her words gnawed at him. Evidence didn't just disappear, not from a high-profile case like this, not unless someone wanted it gone. He made his way down the corridor to the records office, where a weary clerk sat behind a counter, flipping through case binders. The man barely looked up when Daniel entered. Afternoon, Daniel greeted. Level moderate. Officer Holt, case 7329, the Alvarez file. I need to confirm the hospital documents that were submitted. The clerk tapped on his keyboard lazily. All exhibits are accounted for, officer. Hospital intake report, photographs, and statements are filed under Exhibit Group C. Daniel leaned forward. Can I see them? Not without a written request from the prosecutor's office, the clerk replied flatly. Protocol. I just need to check something, Daniel insisted. There's mention of a missing note, a nurse's observation and medical summary. It's not in the file? The clerk frowned slightly and typed a few more keys. After a pause, he shook his head. No such document listed. Daniel's stomach dropped. You're sure? Positive, the clerk said, closing the file. Everything matches the court submission. If it's not logged, it doesn't exist. But Daniel knew better. Evidence didn't vanish. It got buried. He thanked the clerk and walked out, Rex padding silently beside him. The hallway was empty now, the building settling into its late evening stillness. The trial would resume in the morning, but for now, there was nothing left to do. At least, nothing official. Hours later, long after most lights had gone dark, Daniel found himself in the evidence wing, a long corridor lined with steel cabinets and filing drawers. The hum of the fluorescent lamps was the only sound. The air smelled faintly of paper, metal, and cold dust. Rex trotted beside him, nails clicking softly against the tile. His presence was grounding, solid, familiar. Daniel sank onto a chair near the end of the corridor, rubbing his temples. If only you could tell me where to look, buddy, he murmured. You always find what I can't. Rex tilted his head, studying him. Then, without warning, the dog's ears twitched. He sniffed the air once, twice, and then moved toward the far end of the hallway. What is it? Daniel asked quietly. Rex didn't respond, of course. He just walked with purpose, nose low, tail stiff. He stopped in front of a tall, locked cabinet marked Archive, Restricted Access. His body went rigid. Then he let out a low growl. Daniel frowned, standing. That's not our file area, Rex. But the dog kept sniffing, pawing lightly at the bottom drawer, then pacing back and forth in front of it. His movements were deliberate, focused, almost insistent. Come on, buddy. That's off limits. Daniel reached for the leash, but Rex didn't move. His hackles rose slightly, not in aggression, but in warning. A signal Daniel had seen countless times in the field when Rex had caught a scent of something critical. The officer froze. The room suddenly felt colder. Rex's nose pressed against the cabinet again, a soft whine escaping his throat. Daniel hesitated, heart pounding. What are you picking up, boy? He whispered. For a long moment, he stood there in silence, the sound of the dog's steady breathing echoing against the walls. Then it hit him. A faint smell of paper and something else, metallic, like ink and blood, trapped under metal and time. He knelt beside Rex, running a hand down his neck. "You really think something's in there?" Rex looked at him, eyes sharp and unblinking. Then, almost as if answering, he sat down right in front of the cabinet, refusing to move. Daniel exhaled slowly. A chill crawled down his spine. Maybe it was just old paperwork. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, the same instinct that had saved lives before now whispered otherwise. "All right," he murmured, standing. "Tomorrow, we dig deeper. Whatever's hiding in there, we'll find it." Rex's tail flicked once, a quiet acknowledgement. As Daniel turned off the hallway lights, he glanced back at the cabinet one last time. The silver label glinted faintly in the dark, cold and unyielding. Somewhere behind that metal door, buried under protocol and silence, something crucial was waiting to be found. And by morning, Daniel knew, Rex would lead him straight to it. The next morning arrived heavy with anticipation and dread. The sky above the courthouse was the color of cold steel, a reflection of what awaited inside. Reporters had gathered again, cameras flashing, microphones thrust forward like spears. Every headline screamed, "Trial on the brink." Inside, the atmosphere was no less volatile. The murmur of voices filled the courtroom, an uneasy hum that carried both tension and fatigue. The prosecutor, Miss Jennings, sat at her desk, eyes red from a night without sleep. Papers were stacked neatly before her, though her hands trembled slightly as she tried to review them. Across the room, Martin Calloway, the accused, leaned back in his chair, his lips curved into a faint, smug smile. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, and he chuckled under his breath. The sound like a splinter in Daniel's nerves. From his post by the double doors, Officer Daniel Holt stood motionless, one hand resting on the leash of his German Shepherd partner, Rex. The dog sat obediently at his side, dark eyes scanning the room with quiet focus. Yet even in stillness, Daniel could sense the tension in him. Muscles coiled, ears twitching, nose occasionally lifting as if catching a scent the rest of them couldn't. Daniel's heart was heavy. The night before hadn't brought sleep, only thoughts that refused to rest. The missing medical records haunted him. The memory of Rex growling before the locked cabinet echoed in his mind like a warning. Something's in there, he'd thought. Something that shouldn't be hidden. The bailiff's voice broke through his thoughts. "All rise." The judge entered, her black robe flowing behind her. "Court is now in session." Everyone sat. The prosecutor rose, her expression composed but tired. "Your Honor," she began, "we are continuing the cross-examination of the witness. However..." Before she could continue, the defense lawyer cut in smoothly. "Your Honor, the defense intends to request dismissal if the prosecution cannot produce further substantiated evidence. We are wasting the court's time with inconsistent testimony." The judge shot him a warning look. "You'll have your turn, counselor. Proceed." Jennings swallowed hard. Daniel could see the strain in her face, the quiet panic beneath her calm. Without new evidence, she was cornered, and the defense knew it. Lena sat on the stand again, clutching her teddy bear. Her small frame seemed even smaller today, her eyes dim. Daniel could feel her fear like static in the air. Then something changed. Rex's ears perked up, his body stiffened. The dog's nose lifted slightly, sniffing the air. Once, twice. Daniel frowned, whispering, "What is it, boy?" Rex didn't move, but his gaze locked on the far side of the courtroom, the evidence table. Several sealed folders and envelopes rested there, guarded by an officer. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. But Rex began to tremble. His breathing quickened, his tail lowered. The signals Daniel knew too well. It was the same behavior Rex had shown countless times before a discovery, before a breakthrough. Daniel tugged gently on the leash. "Easy, Rex. Not now." The dog didn't respond. And then, without warning, Rex bolted. The leash slipped through Daniel's hand before he could react. The powerful German shepherd lunged forward, claws scraping against the polished floor as gasps erupted across the courtroom. "Rex!" Daniel shouted, but it was too late. The dog charged straight toward the evidence section, ignoring the chaos behind him. The bailiff leapt to intercept, but Rex was faster. He jumped onto the platform, knocking over a stack of papers, and locked his jaws around a sealed envelope from the corner of the table. The sound, a sharp tear of paper, echoed through the room like thunder. "Get that dog under control!" the defense lawyer barked, his voice cracking with outrage. Officers rushed forward, trying to grab the leash. The judge slammed her gavel repeatedly, shouting for order. Reporters leaned in from the back rows, cameras clicking frantically. Daniel's heart pounded as he pushed through the commotion. "Rex! Drop it! Drop it, boy!" But Rex refused. His teeth held firm on the envelope, eyes wild but focused. It wasn't defiance. It was instinct. Purpose. Daniel finally reached him, falling to one knee beside his partner. "Easy, buddy," he said softly, voice trembling. "Give it to me. Come on." For a moment, everything went still. The German shepherd's breathing was ragged. His gaze locked on Daniel's. Then, slowly, Rex released his grip and sat back, his chest rising and falling with deep, labored breaths. Daniel's hands shook as he picked up the envelope. The seal had been torn, but the label was still visible, faded black ink scrawled across the top. He froze. Medical record, confidential, child victim. The world seemed to stop. The defense attorney's voice cut through the silence. "This is outrageous. That animal just tampered with evidence." The judge slammed the gavel again, her tone sharp. "Quiet. Officer Holt, what is that document?" Daniel stood slowly, the envelope trembling in his grip. It looks like a hospital record, Your Honor. From the Alvarez case." The prosecutor's head snapped up. "What did you say?" Daniel's voice faltered. These files were never logged." A murmur swept through the courtroom like a wave. Reporters scribbled furiously. The defense lawyer shot to his feet, red-faced. "That's impossible. All exhibits were verified this morning." The judge's expression darkened. "Bailiff, secure that envelope immediately. We will recess while this document is verified." "But, Your Honor." "Now, Counselor." The gavel struck one final time, reverberating through the chamber. "Court is adjourned for 1 hour. Everyone remains available for questioning." The room erupted into noise. Shouts, hurried footsteps, the flash of cameras. Daniel crouched beside Rex, one hand buried in the dog's fur. His heart was still racing. "What did you do, boy?" he whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief. Rex looked up at him, tail twitching, once eyes steady. For the first time that morning, Daniel felt the faint spark of something he hadn't dared to feel since the trial began. Hope. Whatever was inside that envelope, it was about to change everything. The judge's chambers were cloaked in a heavy silence, broken only by the soft rustle of papers and the steady ticking of the wall clock. The rain had begun again, a faint drizzle that streaked the high windows with silver lines. Outside, the courthouse buzzed with speculation. Reporters whispering, phones ringing, the scent of chaos lingering like static in the air. But inside this room, time itself seemed to slow. The sealed envelope lay open on the polished wooden table. The paper inside, creased and faintly smudged, was trembling slightly in the judge's gloved hand as she read. Daniel stood to the side, his uniform damp with sweat despite the cold air. Rex sat beside him, perfectly still, head lowered but alert. The dog's amber eyes darted between the humans, reading them the way he'd been trained to read fear, deceit, truth. At the table sat Prosecutor Jennings, pale and wide-eyed, clutching her pen as though afraid to move. The defense attorney paced like a caged animal, his confidence stripped away, his voice growing shriller with each word. "This is absurd, Your Honor," he snapped. "There is no chain of custody for this document. It could have been planted by anyone, a tampering, a fabrication." The judge's gaze lifted sharply. "Enough, counselor. You'll have your chance to argue. Right now, we're verifying the contents." The bailiff handed over a copy to Jennings. Her lips parted slightly as she skimmed the pages, her voice trembling when she spoke. "Your Honor, this is a medical evaluation from County General Hospital, dated 3 days after the incident. It details multiple contusions consistent with repeated blunt trauma and," she swallowed hard, "and injuries, consistent with the child's account." A heavy silence followed. Even the defense attorney's pacing stopped. The judge flipped to the second page. Her eyes narrowed. "And this?" Jennings leaned forward, scanning the faded handwriting. "It appears to be a confession draft, written by the accused. There's no signature, but the handwriting matches his prior statements on file. It details the same night described by the victim." The defense attorney slammed his hand on the table. "That's impossible. That document was never logged because it doesn't exist." Jennings shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. "Yet here it is." Daniel stood frozen, heart hammering in his chest. His gaze drifted to Rex, who remained silent at his side. "You found it," he thought. "You knew." The judge closed the folder slowly, her expression unreadable. "It appears this document was part of the initial hospital evidence submission," she said quietly. "And somehow, it never reached the case file." The weight of her words filled the room like thunder. Jennings's voice was barely a whisper. "It was hidden." Daniel exhaled slowly. He could feel the pieces clicking into place. The missing records, the false inventory, the way the defense had pushed for a quick dismissal. It hadn't been a mistake. It had been deliberate. The judge set the document down and turned her attention to him. "Officer Holt." He straightened instinctively. "Yes, Your Honor." "That animal of yours. How did he find this envelope?" Daniel hesitated, glancing down at Rex, who looked up at him expectantly. "He reacted to something, ma'am. I don't know what exactly, but he wouldn't leave that spot. He's trained to detect stress responses, blood traces, and human scent profiles." The judge arched an eyebrow. "And what do you think he detected?" Daniel's voice softened. "Fear, maybe, or guilt. Whatever was clinging to that envelope, he could feel it. He's done this long enough to know when something's wrong, even when we can't see it." The judge leaned back, her gaze thoughtful. "An extraordinary circumstance," she murmured, "led by extraordinary instinct." Across the table, the defense attorney opened his mouth to object again, but the judge raised her hand sharply. "Enough. This court will reconvene immediately. We'll let the record decide." When the courtroom doors opened again, the energy inside was electric. The crowd had doubled, whispers rippling through the benches like waves. Every reporter in the county seemed to have found their way inside. The air was thick with curiosity and disbelief. Daniel entered with Rex walking proudly at his side. Cameras flashed from the back rows despite warnings. The judge took her seat, face stern, gavel poised. "This court has reviewed a newly discovered document found within sealed evidence storage," she began, her tone calm but commanding. The document contains medical findings and a written statement pertinent to this case. It will be admitted into evidence, effective immediately. The prosecutor's relief was visible in the slight slump of her shoulders. The defense attorney's face, however, drained of color. He rose shakily. "Your Honor, Sit. Down, counselor," the judge said firmly. "You'll have your turn." Daniel stayed near the back, but his eyes never left Lena. She sat clutching her teddy bear, unaware of the legal storm swirling around her. Her small fingers traced the fabric nervously. Jennings stood, voice steady now, stronger. "With the court's permission, we would like to read the relevant portion of the newly admitted evidence." The judge nodded. Jennings cleared her throat and began. "She cried and said stop, but I couldn't control myself. I told her I was sorry, that I'd make it right, but she wouldn't stop crying." Gasps rippled across the room. Lena's mother pressed her hand to her mouth. Even the jurors seemed frozen. The prosecutor lowered the page, voice trembling. This note was never signed, but the handwriting and phrasing matched those of the accused's prior police interviews. The judge looked toward the defense table. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Calloway?" The man's face was ashen. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. And then, a small sound broke the silence. A faint sniffle from the witness stand. Lena was looking at Rex. The dog was sitting calmly near the front, ears forward, eyes fixed on her. She blinked through her tears, her lips trembling. "He found my truth," she whispered. The words were soft, but they carried through the room like music, fragile, yet unbreakable. Daniel felt his throat tighten. The courtroom for once seemed to hold its breath. The judge adjusted her glasses, her tone gentler than before, level moderate. "Perhaps, Miss Lena, he did." And with that, she struck the gavel once, not to silence but to affirm. The truth, buried and silenced, had finally been heard. The verdict wasn't in yet, but the world outside the courthouse had already erupted. By the next morning, news vans lined the streets for 3 blocks. Reporters crowded the steps, microphones raised like spears, shouting questions that cut through the icy air. Headlines screamed across every screen and newspaper. "Police dog uncovers hidden evidence. Hero or breach of protocol." Courtroom chaos. Was the K9 a hero or a legal disaster? Public opinion split in two, fierce and unrelenting. Some called Rex a savior, a symbol of truth. Others accused the department of staging a stunt, claiming evidence manipulation. Inside the precinct, Officer Daniel Holt sat in the briefing room, his head bowed over a stack of official papers, the kind that always smelled faintly of toner and accusation. Across from him, a sergeant from Internal Affairs flipped through his report with cold precision. The words were clinical, detached. Possible evidence contamination, breach of chain of custody, non-compliance with courtroom protocol. Daniel's badge lay on the table beside his coffee cup. A small, shining emblem that had once meant purpose, now reduced to a question mark. The sergeant didn't look up as he spoke. "You understand, Holt, that even if your intentions were good, your K9's actions technically violated courtroom procedure." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I didn't order him to do it." "I believe you," the sergeant replied. "But belief doesn't change the paperwork. The department's under scrutiny. The defense has filed a formal complaint. You're looking at a possible suspension pending review." Silence stretched between them. Daniel could hear the hum of the overhead lights, the distant chatter of officers in the hall, life moving on while his own stood still. Finally, he said quietly, "We found the truth. Isn't that what matters?" The sergeant sighed, closing the folder. "It should be. But the world doesn't work that simply, Holt. Not anymore. When Daniel left the room, the air outside felt heavier. The precinct, once a place that smelled of coffee and purpose, now seemed cold, impersonal. Whispers followed him down the hallway. Some clapped him on the shoulder as he passed. Others avoided his gaze. "Hero cop," one voice murmured. "Lucky break," said another. "Or maybe he got reckless." He didn't respond. He just walked to his office at the end of the hall, where Rex was waiting. The dog lifted his head the moment Daniel entered, tail thumping once against the floor before settling again. His calm eyes seemed to ask a question his handler couldn't answer. Daniel sank into his chair, unbuttoning his uniform collar. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a reminder that his future was dangling in bureaucratic limbo. He looked at the framed photos on his desk. The first day he and Rex graduated from K-9 training. A shot from the rescue that made local headlines. A smiling boy hugging Rex after being found in the woods. Every image felt like another lifetime. Now, those same hands that once gave him commendations were writing his disciplinary file. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, and whispered to the dog, "Did we do the right thing, Rex? Or did we cross the line?" Rex tilted his head, then rose and patted closer. He rested his chin on Daniel's knee, warm and solid. Daniel's hand found the familiar spot behind his ear. "You didn't care about rules," he said softly. "You just cared about her." The words hung in the air like confession. Outside the window, the city glowed in the late afternoon light. Cars blurring past, people living lives untouched by the moral knots of one man and his dog. The door creaked open. Daniel turned, expecting another officer, but instead, Mrs. Alvarez stepped in. She looked hesitant, clutching a small brown paper bag in both hands. "Mrs. Alvarez," Daniel said, standing quickly, "you shouldn't be here. The trial isn't over yet." "I know," she replied, her voice gentle, "but I needed to come." She walked closer, her expression softening when she saw Rex. "May I?" Daniel nodded. She knelt beside the dog, opening the bag. The scent of homemade cookies, butter and cinnamon, filled the air. "These are for him," she said, smiling through weary eyes. "My daughter insisted." Rex sniffed the air eagerly, tail wagging for the first time in days. He took the treat delicately from her hand and began to chew with slow satisfaction. Mrs. Alvarez looked up at Daniel. "He hasn't left her dreams, you know. Every night, Lena asks if he's okay." Daniel swallowed hard. "She's holding up?" "As best as she can," the woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "The doctors say it'll take time, but she's lighter now. She laughs sometimes, and when I asked her why, she said it's because the dog found her truth." Daniel felt his throat close. He turned away, pretending to straighten the papers on his desk, but his hands were shaking. "She wanted me to tell you," Mrs. Alvarez continued softly, "that without him she might never have been brave enough to speak." Silence filled the room. Only the soft crunch of Rex's chewing broke it. Daniel exhaled slowly, blinking away the burn in his eyes. "She doesn't owe us anything," he murmured. "We just did what we had to." Mrs. Alvarez smiled faintly. "You did more than that. You reminded her that not everyone in a uniform is scary, and you reminded me that sometimes faith wears fur." Her words hit deeper than she could have known. Rex finished his cookie and gently nudged her hand for another. The woman laughed, a sound fragile but real. After she left, the quiet returned. Daniel sat for a long time, staring at the badge on his desk. The metal gleamed faintly under the lamplight, its reflection warping as his fingers brushed against it. He thought about everything. The missing evidence, the chaos, the accusations, the line between right and wrong. Somewhere along that line, he'd stopped being just a cop and become something else, something messier, more human. Rex let out a low sigh and laid his head on Daniel's lap again. Daniel smiled faintly, his voice a whisper meant only for the dog. You did good, partner. No matter what they say, you did good. Rex's tail tapped softly against the floor in quiet agreement, and for the first time in days, the weight pressing against Daniel's chest eased, not gone but lighter, carried by the steady heartbeat of the only partner who had never once let him down. The courthouse was quieter than it had been in weeks. Gone were the shouts of the reporters and the restless energy of a public hungry for scandal. What remained was something heavier, reverent, almost sacred. It was the final day of the trial, and every person inside knew they were about to witness the end of something that had shaken not only a courtroom, but the faith people had in truth itself. Officer Daniel Holt stood near the back of the courtroom, uniform pressed, expression unreadable. The badge on his chest gleamed under the dim lights. The same badge he'd almost lost, now a reminder of the line he had crossed to find justice. Beside him, Rex, his German Shepherd partner, lay still, his head resting on his paws. His calm presence was a silent anchor in a room filled with tension. At the front, Prosecutor Jennings organized her notes with trembling hands, though she barely needed them anymore. The evidence, once frail and fragmented, now stood solid as stone. The rediscovered medical report, the confession draft, and the child's testimony that had finally found its voice. Across from her, Martin Calloway, the accused, sat slumped in his chair. His once confident posture had collapsed. His suit hung loose, his eyes dull. The man who had smirked through weeks of testimony now looked like a hollow shell, someone cornered not by law, but by truth itself. The judge entered, robe flowing, expression stern. The murmurs died instantly. Every eye turned forward. Even the rain had stopped outside, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Court is now in session, the judge said, her voice steady but heavy. We are here to deliver the verdict in the case of the state versus Martin Calloway. A pause followed, long enough for Daniel to feel the heartbeat in his throat. The sound of someone shifting in the back row echoed too loudly. Then, the judge's gaze moved from the papers before her to the accused. The jury has reached a unanimous decision. The prosecutor lowered her head. The defense attorney straightened, hands clenched tightly on the table. The judge continued, her voice clear, measured. In light of the newly submitted medical evidence and the corroborating handwritten statement, this court finds the defendant, Martin Calloway, guilty on all counts of aggravated assault and child abuse. The words dropped into the silence like thunder. Lena's mother gasped, hand flying to her mouth. Jennings closed her eyes for a moment, letting out a breath she'd been holding for days. A ripple of relief, disbelief, and quiet triumph swept through the courtroom. But for a long moment, no one moved. And then, a small cry. Lena, who had been sitting quietly beside the counselor, suddenly covered her face with her hands and sobbed. The dam of fear, confusion, and silence that had built inside her finally broke. She turned, searching the room through tears. And when her eyes met Rex's, she stood abruptly, teddy bear tumbling from her lap. Before anyone could stop her, she ran down the aisle toward him. "Lena," her mother called softly, but the girl didn't stop. She threw her small arms around Rex's neck, burying her face in his fur. The German Shepherd, startled for only a second, lifted his head and gently rested it on her knee, his tail wagging in slow, rhythmic strokes. The entire room seemed to exhale at once. Reporters lowered their cameras. Officers who had seen too much pain in their careers turned away to hide their eyes. Even the judge, stoic and controlled, paused before speaking again. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes for sentencing," she said quietly. "Until then, this session stands adjourned." The gavel struck once, but its sound was drowned out by the emotion filling the air. Daniel felt his vision blur. He blinked hard, but the tears came anyway. He had seen victory before: arrests, convictions, the satisfaction of cases closed, but nothing like this. This was something cleaner, something raw, the kind of justice that didn't just punish, it healed. As people began to leave, a quiet moment settled around the small circle at the front of the courtroom. The child, the mother, and the dog. Rex shifted slightly, his head still pressed against Lena's leg. She whispered something only he could hear. Perhaps it was a thank you. Perhaps it was something simpler, a goodbye to fear. Daniel stepped forward slowly, stopping a few feet away. His eyes softened as he watched them. Jennings approached him, her voice low. "You know," she said, "I've been in courtrooms for 15 years. I've seen the worst of humanity, but I've never seen something pure like that." Daniel nodded, unable to speak. His voice was trapped somewhere between pride and exhaustion. The defense attorney was already packing up, avoiding everyone's gaze. His client sat motionless, head bowed. There would be no outburst, no plea for mercy. The truth had crushed even denial. Lena looked up from where she sat with Rex, her cheeks still wet. Her eyes met Daniel's, wide, innocent, but no longer hollow. There was light there now, faint but real. "Officer Daniel," she said softly, her voice barely carrying across the room. "You and Rex, you made the bad stop." The simplicity of it undid him completely. Daniel smiled, though his lips trembled. "No, sweetheart," he said quietly. "You did. You told the truth. We just helped you be brave." The girl nodded, then hugged Rex tighter. The dog's tail thumped once more. By the time the room emptied, only Daniel, Rex, and the echo of what had just happened remained. He knelt beside his partner, scratching behind the dog's ear. "We did it, buddy," he whispered. "You really did it." Rex looked up at him, panting softly, tongue lolling out in that lazy grin that only a dog could wear after chaos. Daniel chuckled under his breath, the sound breaking through his tears. For once there was no bitterness in his heart, only gratitude. He turned toward the window, where faint sunlight broke through the clouds for the first time in days. The light spilled across the wooden floor, pooling near Lena and Rex. A quiet, perfect moment of peace. And for the first time since the trial began, justice didn't feel like paperwork or rules. It felt human. Daniel stood there for a long moment, hand resting on Rex's head, tears glistening on his face. Around them, the room was silent, but in that silence lived the weight of everything they had fought for, and everything they had reclaimed. When he finally turned to leave, he glanced once more at the child who had found her voice, and the dog who had found her truth. It wasn't just a victory. It was redemption. For her, for him, and for the law itself. Months had passed since the verdict, yet the echoes of that trial still lingered like a faint hum beneath the city's rhythm. Headlines had long faded, news crews had moved on, but the story of the police dog who found the truth had left a mark that refused to vanish. Some called it divine instinct, others called it luck. A few, the loudest skeptics, called it misconduct dressed as miracle. For Officer Daniel Holt, it was neither miracle nor scandal, just a moment that had stripped away the gray layers of the world and revealed something unshakably pure. Still, purity didn't pay bills or silence bureaucracy. By the end of the season, Daniel and his German Shepherd partner, Rex, were reassigned to a quieter division: community support and training. It wasn't punishment exactly, but it wasn't honor either. It was the department's polite way of saying, you did something extraordinary, but you made people uncomfortable doing it. Their new days were slower. Patrols replaced by school visits, demonstrations, and routine safety checks. Daniel didn't complain. Rex didn't seem to mind either. As long as he could work, smell the air, and hear Daniel's voice, he was content. But sometimes, when Daniel passed the old courthouse on his way home, he'd feel it all over again. The chaos, the fear, the fragile silence before Lena had whispered, "He found my truth." That memory never left him. It was a bright Saturday morning when the city decided to officially close the case, not in court, but in spirit. The precinct organized a small ceremony at the Civic Center to honor those involved. The mayor would speak, the chief would give remarks, and a handful of journalists would cover it for the evening broadcast. Daniel had tried to skip it. "We don't need applause," he muttered while buttoning his uniform that morning. But his captain insisted. "You're part of this story whether you like it or not," the man had said. "And that dog of yours deserves a day in the sun." So Daniel went. The Civic Center lawn was buzzing with families, officers, and reporters. Banners fluttered in the breeze. Community Day of Justice and Healing. Children laughed, music played faintly, and tables were filled with cookies and lemonade. The air smelled like grass and sunlight, a far cry from the courtroom's sterile chill. Rex walked beside Daniel, his fur gleaming in the light, his gait proud but relaxed. He wore his K9 vest, polished and fitted, though his leash hung loose. Wherever he went, heads turned. People whispered and smiled. "That's him," someone said softly. "That's the dog from the case." Cameras clicked. Daniel offered polite nods but avoided attention. He wasn't built for ceremony. Then the police chief took the stage. A tall man with a voice that carried authority and warmth in equal measure. He adjusted the microphone and looked out at the crowd. "Today," he began, "we're not here to talk about controversy. We're here to talk about courage, and about the moments that remind us why we do what we do." The audience quieted. Months ago, a case shook this city. It challenged our system, our faith in procedure, even our understanding of justice itself. But in the middle of it all stood one officer and one dog, who reminded us of something we often forget. Sometimes, instinct is the highest form of truth. Applause broke out. Daniel felt his stomach twist. Rex lifted his head at the sound, ears flicking forward. The chief smiled faintly. "Our job is to follow evidence, to trust reason and law. But reason alone doesn't always lead to the right place. That's why we need something else: heart, intuition, empathy. That's why we need people like Officer Holt and partners like Rex." More applause. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras zoomed in. Daniel stood stiffly at the edge of the crowd, hands folded behind his back. He hadn't expected to be mentioned by name. He certainly hadn't expected the audience to turn and look at him. A few officers clapped him on the shoulder, grinning, but the attention slid off him easily. His gaze drifted to the front row, where Lena sat with her mother. She looked so different now. Healthier, brighter, her hair neatly tied in a ribbon, her eyes full of something that hadn't been there before. Peace. She wasn't the trembling shadow who'd once clutched a teddy bear in terror. She was just a little girl again. In her hands, she held a small certificate framed in silver. The bold letters read, "For courage and hope." When the applause swelled again, Rex turned toward her, tail wagging. Lena giggled and raised her hand to wave at him. "Hi, Rex," she called softly. Her voice, once broken by fear, was light and sure now. Rex wagged harder, the steady rhythm of his tail thumping against Daniel's leg. The chief motioned for them to come forward. Daniel hesitated, but a nudge from a fellow officer pushed him toward the stage. The crowd parted as he walked up the steps, Rex following obediently. Flashes popped from cameras. A journalist called out, "Officer Holt, what was he thinking that day in court?" Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "I don't think he was thinking," he replied. "He was just doing what was right." Laughter rippled through the crowd. The chief extended his hand. "You and your partner reminded us what justice can look like when it's human and loyal." Daniel shook his hand. "Thank you, sir." The chief looked down at Rex and grinned. "And as for you, officer, I hear you're not big on medals." The crowd chuckled again. Rex tilted his head, as if in confusion, tongue lolling out. The chief continued, "But maybe that's the point. Not every hero wears a badge or understands what applause means. Sometimes the purest kind of bravery comes from the ones who act without ever needing to be told they're good." For a moment, the applause softened into something quieter, respectful, emotional. Daniel looked at his partner, at the calm, noble creature sitting proudly beside him, and felt the sting of tears behind his eyes. He blinked them away quickly. The ceremony ended with a standing ovation. The crowd cheered as Lena and her mother approached the stage. Lena handed Rex one of her cookies from a paper napkin. "You're my hero," she said simply. Rex sniffed the cookie, then ate it delicately, crumbs sticking to his nose. The girl laughed, the sound clear and full of light. Daniel knelt beside her, smiling softly. "He thinks you're the brave one," he said. She shook her head. "No, we both were." For the rest of the afternoon, the city celebrated. But as the music faded and the crowd began to thin, Daniel stayed by the stage, looking out at the horizon. The sun was sinking low, its gold reflection glimmering off Rex's fur. No medals, no promotions. Just peace, and for Daniel, that was more than enough. The years drifted by softly, like pages of a well-loved book turning themselves. Seasons came and went, but some bonds didn't fade with time. They simply grew quieter, deeper, and more sacred. It had been nearly a decade since that trial, since the day a frightened child found her voice, and a loyal dog changed the meaning of justice forever. The world had moved on, but in one modest suburban home at the edge of the city, memories lived on in every corner. The afternoon sun spilled through the window of Officer Daniel Holt's living room, painting soft golden patterns across the floorboards. The furniture was simple, the air faintly scented with coffee and pine wood. On one wall hung a collection of framed photographs, snapshots of service, rescue missions, and one picture that always drew the eye: a young girl hugging a German shepherd, both framed in light, both smiling. Beneath that photo, curled on an old checkered blanket, Rex lay sleeping. His fur, once sleek and dark, was now streaked with gray. His breathing came slow, steady, but faint. Age had crept up on him with gentle persistence, dulling his energy but never dimming the warmth in his eyes. Daniel sat nearby in a worn armchair, book forgotten in his lap. His gaze was distant, fixed on the dog he had shared more than half his career with. The ticking clock filled the silence between them, slow and rhythmic, a heartbeat of the house. He had always known this day would come. He'd tried not to think about it. But lately, each sunrise felt heavier. Each time Rex struggled to stand, each time his steps grew slower, Daniel felt that quiet ache, the one that came not from fear, but from knowing that love, no matter how loyal, is never immortal. A gentle knock sounded at the door. Time for hums. Daniel rose, stretching the stiffness from his knees. When he opened it, a familiar voice greeted him. "Hi, Officer Holt." Standing there was Lena, now 17. Tall, confident, her hair tucked behind her ears. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers wrapped in paper. The sunlight caught the soft pink hue of her dress, and for a brief moment, Daniel saw the same little girl who once clung to a teddy bear, trembling in a courtroom. He smiled warmly. "Lena, you didn't have to come all the way out here." "I wanted to," she said softly, holding out the flowers. "Mom said it's been a while, and I wanted to see him." Daniel stepped aside. "He'll be glad you did." She entered quietly, her eyes landing on the aging German shepherd. Her smile wavered, a mix of affection and heartbreak crossing her face. "He looks peaceful," she whispered. "He is," Daniel said, his voice low. "He's tired, but he's still himself." Lena knelt beside Rex, setting the flowers on the floor next to his blanket. She reached out, gently brushing her hand along his muzzle. "Hey, old boy," she said, her voice trembling. "Remember me?" Rex stirred. His eyes fluttered open, cloudy now, but still full of that unmistakable light. His tail thumped once, faintly, against the floor. Lena smiled through tears. "Yeah," she whispered. "You remember." She sat there for a long moment, stroking his fur, her voice soft and full of memory. "I never told you this, but you changed everything for me. After that day, I wasn't afraid anymore. You made me believe that truth matters, that even when no one listens, it's still worth saying." Rex blinked slowly, his gaze fixed on her as if he understood every word. Daniel watched from the armchair, a lump rising in his throat. There was something deeply humbling about the scene. This circle closing, the child who'd once needed saving now returning to say goodbye. Lena leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You taught me what truth means," she said, resting her forehead gently against his. Rex's breathing grew shallower. His tail gave one last, soft tap against the blanket. His eyes lifted toward Daniel, then back to Lena. And for a moment, the air in the room felt still, almost sacred. Then, with one quiet exhale, Rex closed his eyes. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of years, of loyalty, of love that didn't need words. Lena's tears fell silently onto the dog's fur. Daniel knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. He didn't speak. There were no words that could measure what this moment meant. Minutes passed before she finally looked up at him. "He's gone, isn't he?" Daniel nodded, his voice thick. "Yeah, but not really." Lena glanced at the photo wall, at the framed moments of Rex's life. "He'll always be here," she murmured. Daniel smiled faintly. "Everywhere," he said. He stood slowly, covering the old blanket around Rex one last time. His movements were careful, almost reverent, like folding a flag. When he was done, he walked to the wall above the mantel. There hung a framed K9 badge, polished and shining despite the years. Beside it was a letter, written in a child's handwriting, laminated carefully. The ink had faded, but the words were still clear. "Thank you for finding my truth, Lena." Daniel stared at it for a long time, his vision blurring. He wasn't crying out of grief. It wasn't loss that ached in his chest. It was gratitude. He whispered, "You did your duty, partner. Better than any of us ever could." When he turned, Lena was standing beside him, eyes on the badge. He didn't speak our language, she said softly. Daniel nodded, his voice barely steady. But he told the truth better than any of us ever could. They stood there together, two souls bound forever by a single act of courage from a dog who never asked for praise. Outside, the wind stirred the trees, carrying the faint scent of pine and rain, the same scent that had filled the courthouse years ago when it all began. And somewhere in that quiet rustle of leaves, Daniel could almost hear it, the echo of a bark, strong and steady, fading into eternity. In the end, Rex's story isn't just about justice. It's about love, loyalty, and the quiet understanding that lives between humans and their dogs. German shepherds like him remind us that courage doesn't always come with medals, and truth doesn't always need words. Sometimes it's found in a wagging tail, a gentle nudge, or the steady presence of a soul who simply refuses to give up on you. If this story touched your heart, maybe take a moment to look into ways to deepen your bond with your own dog, through training, shared time, or even just learning to listen a little closer. There's a wonderful resource I've found helpful for building that kind of connection. You can find it here if you'd like to explore more. No pressure at all, just something that might bring you and your four-legged friend a little closer. After all, love like theirs deserves to be understood, celebrated, and never taken for granted.